Hello all, and welcome back to my history series. This is my third episode, and so far, I hope it's been good and that the information presented has been clear and helpful. Now onto the actual episode, we pick up on the coup d'etat by Napoleon and his subsequent Napoleonic Wars, or Wars of the Coalition. In it, Napoleon took on all of Europe by himself, was actually doing pretty well until he met a foe that even he couldn't beat, the Russian winter. Preceding this, Napoleon also sold Louisiana to the US in order to fund his military, and thanks to that, America was able to double its size in the early stages of its country. Also, Napoleon defeated a combined force of Austrians and Russians at the Battle of Austerlitz, effectively dissolving the HRE and creating the new Confederation of the Rhine, a satellite state of the French which served as a buffer between Napoleon's foes in the East Central and Eastern Europe. In 1806, Napoleon established the continental system as a means of waging economic warfare on the British by starving them of their trading partners in Europe. His downfall came in 1812, when after the Russians had left the system, in 1810, he invaded. The Russians employed the tactic of running away, tactical retreating, in order to suck the French further and further into the Russian heartland, along with employing a scorched earth policy to deny the French of Russian supplies that they might leave behind. Napoleon had made it to Moscow in September of 1812, but he found the city deserted, and after waiting a month for the Russian surrender, he was forced to turn around, a tail between his legs, and retreat out of Russia. Now, however, the Russians came to play, harassing the French all of the way out of Russia and back into France. Paris was captured in 1814 by a coalition of Allied forces, and Napoleon was banished to the island of Elba, where he was never to be heard of again. Until he came back in a year and started the whole thing again. He escaped Elba and returned to Paris, where he was greeted by cheering crowds eager to start the whole conquest again. He struck first into Belgium, where he was met by the British at Waterloo, and he was crushed, and this time forced to abdicate for good, and he was banished to the remote island of St. Helena, never to be seen again. This time he was put away for good, and he lived out the rest of his life on that island. After this, the major powers of Europe met to describe the future of a post-Napoleonic Europe. They met in Vienna at, you guessed it, the Congress of Vienna. There, the four major powers, Austria, Prussia, England, and Russia, congregated to discuss the future of a post-Napoleonic Europe. France was also invited, but as they had just had their behinds handed to them a few years prior, their input was nominal. Other powers like the Spanish and Portuguese were present, but they also played a lesser role in the proceedings. The Treaty of Paris, which came out of this Congress, formally ended the Napoleonic Wars and re-established France to their borders in 1792 and brought back the House of Bourbon, or the ruling house of France before the French Revolution. Another important idea or system of government that grew out of the Congress was the rise of conservatism, sometimes referred to as Metternichian conservatism after Prince Clemens von Metternich of Austria. Metternichian conservatism was primarily a response to the revolutionary fires stoked by the French Revolution, and the ideology revolved around obedience to order, anti-revolutionary action, and maintaining the status quo. This was especially important in multicultural empires such as the Russian, Austrian, or Ottoman empires, as they had to deal with nationalistic separatists wanting to break from the crown. The Congress was also significant because it allowed for the first real framework of a continental system of alliances, and it served as the framework until 1914. Moving on, I'd like to talk about the Zollverein, the German Trades and Customs Unions, which was made to encourage free trade and improve the economy in German states. Why is that important, you ask? Well, the Zollverein, it's a nightmare to pronounce, served as a means of proliferating the sort of rivalry between Prussia and Austria, the two dominant Germanic powers in the region. With the creation of the Zollverein, Prussia managed to exclude Austria from freely trading with the rest of the German states and secured closer ties to them, to be used later on in the timeline when Germany unified under the Prussians, but more on that later. So generally, the Germanic states were kind of divided and split up into regional powers, and basically the debate was between Prussia and Austria for whoever could have the dominant influence over those states, and it ended up being Prussia. So we'll see that later. More on trade in this time. A couple of years before the Zollverein was put into effect, Britain tried to limit free trade through the Corn Laws, a series of tariffs and trade restrictions passed in 1815 that harmed manufacturers and the people by inflating the price of corn or grain in Britain. Of course, these laws were incredibly unpopular among just about everyone but the rich. The Anti-Corn Law League was founded in 1839 in a magazine called The Economist, which still runs today, in order to provide a voice against the corn laws. The laws were finally abolished in 1846 following the Irish potato famine, which of course brought famine all across Ireland and forced millions to emigrate. I apologize for being all over the place here, but I will settle down as I talk more about country-oriented revolutions. Starting with the Greek War of Independence, starting in 1821 and ending with the Treaty of Adrianople in 1829, and the modern Greek state was liberated and born. The rest of Europe took sympathy to the Greek cause, as Greek literature and culture formed the basis for Western classical heritage, as we saw in the Renaissance, including the famous poet Lord Byron, by taking up arms to assist the Greeks. The spirit of Pan-Hellenism can also be put under the umbrella of nationalism, which was one of the prevailing ideologies that influenced countries under occupation, as I discussed with Metternician conservatism. So Germany split from the Ottoman Empire as one example of a nationalistic revolution. Next, there was a series of revolutions in 1830, starting in France, where else, in which Charles X, the new Bourbon king, was forced to abdicate and hand over the kingship to Louis Philippe I, who reigned until the other massive revolutionary wave in 1848, which coincidentally is what I'll talk about next. The spring of 1848 is also known as the Springtime of Nations due to the large number of revolutions that occurred in 1848, obviously. I'll start with the revolution that had the biggest impact on the world in Hungary. Originally, Hungarians in the cities of Buda and Pest, now Budapest, forced the imperial government to accept their 12 points of demands, which included things like freedom of the press, an elected parliament, a national bank, a Hungarian army, etc. As you might expect, the Austrians didn't really like one of their subjects demanding different things, so they sought to put the revolt down. At the start, however, everything looked peachy for the Hungarians. They were defeating the Austrian forces until Emperor Franz Joseph I had to call on the Russians to put down the revolution in 1849. Hungary was placed under martial law and was forced to adopt the policy of Germanization until the Austro-Hungarian Compromise following Austria's defeat to Prussia in a war in 1867. I'll get to that later when I talk about Prussian unification. Another important revolution was that in France, again, where else? When the people rose up a la French Revolution and demanded that the people be able to rule themselves. This revolution ended the 18-year-long rule of Louis Philippe and established the Second French Republic, with Louis Napoleon as president, but he, like his uncle Napoleon, like original Napoleon, staged a coup d'etat and seized power for himself and declared the Second French Empire. I told you that these French governments were going to get jumbled, and I think I'm delivering. These revolutions were defined by the people rising up to seize power. Moving on, I'd like to go into the unifications of Germany and Italy, starting with the latter. After the Roman Empire fell, the Italian peninsula was broken into a fragment of states, each conducting their own business. As time went on, ideas of unification started to enter people's minds, and during the revolutionary period of 1848, attempts were made by Italian nationalists such as Giuseppe Mazzini or Cesare Balbo. These attempts proved futile, but all hope wasn't lost. King Victor Emmanuel II of Sardinia Piedmont, so that's kind of in the northwest region of the country where Turin is. Turin's a city in Piedmont, actually. So King Victor Emmanuel II had visions of a grand unified Italy, and with the help of his most important statesman, Camillo Benso de Cavour, he was going to do it. It started with the Franco-Austrian War of 1859, in which Victor Emmanuel allied himself with the French in order to take the state of Lombardy from the Austrians. Lombardy is also in the north. I think that's where Milan is. So they were successful, and Italy got Lombardy after ceding a part of land in the western part of Piedmont, which includes the present-day city of Nice. The aftermath of this war also prompted the various states of northern Italy to hold plebiscites to join Sardinia Piedmont. There was another player in this entire endeavor, Giuseppe Garibaldi, whose knowledge of guerrilla warfare helped him and 1,000 others toppled the empire of the Two Sicilies and helped Victor Emmanuel secure the southern part of the peninsula. Now all of Italy was unified except for the French-protected Rome. In 1870, the Italians got their chance to take Rome when the French declared war on the Prussians, so Rome was left unguarded. Italian troops entered the Papal States or Rome and annexed the territory, finally incorporating the entirety of the peninsula all under one flag. The ruling family of Sardinia-Piedmont were able to be the rulers of Italy, and the capital was moved to Rome, where it remains today. Now, onto the German unification under the Prussians. As you may know from previous episodes, the land that made up Germany in the 1850s and before was fractured up into a hodgepodge of different entities, ranging in sizes from Prussia to cities like Ulm. We start with perhaps the most important figure in not just Germany, but in all of Europe during this time period, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck was Kaiser Wilhelm I's prime minister, or chancellor in German, and it was through Bismarck's scheming and diplomacy that Germany was formed. The idea of a unified German state hadn't actually been all that popular, as most of the princely states that made up the German region wanted autonomy, much like some of the states do in the US. But when Napoleon invaded and occupied parts of Germany, he stirred nationalistic sentiments and got people thinking about whether or not a country should be unified through language and customs. In 1848, an attempt was made to unify by the Frankfurt Parliament with liberal reforms at Kaiser Friedrich Wilhelm IV as emperor of a new German state. Unfortunately, Kaiser Wilhelm I did not accept the proposition, and the dream was dead. For now. Fast forward to the 1860s, in which Bismarck is trying to keep the dream alive. He was elected as the Chancellor of Prussia in 1863, and Prussia won their first major war in 1864 against Denmark and Austria in the Denmark War and 7 Weeks' War, securing Schleswig and Holstein, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, 2 northern states for Prussia. Soon after, Bismarck convinced many of the North German states to join Prussia, forming the, you guessed it, North German Confederation. Moving on a few years to 1870, Bismarck saw his opportunity to unify with the southern German states by declaring war on France. He reasoned that through fear of the French, the states would join Prussia to form a stronger union. The war lasted roughly 7 months, and it was a rousing success for the Prussians. They drove deep into France, and even caused Paris to rise up against the French government at the time. With this, on January 18th, 1871, Kaiser Wilhelm I was crowned Emperor of Germany in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles, and Germany as a whole, plus the state of Alsace-Lorraine from France, which today is back in French control, which irked them to no end. So Germany was now unified, immediately making them one of the most dominant land forces in all of Europe, and coupled with the military tradition of Prussia, it made their army and their country all the more stronger. Now, I know I was talking about nationalistic revolutions, but I skipped over a pretty important revolution in the economic sphere, which would obviously be the Industrial Revolution. It all started in 1764 when a Scottish engineer by the name of James Watt, which is where watts come from today, improved on an existing steam engine and patented his own in 1769. The steam engine was first used in factories all over Britain first and then Europe. Richard Arkwright was the first to use Watt's engine to power textile machinery, forming the basis for the textile industry in Britain. These engines would soon be arranged into rooms where a whole host of people could work in, thus creating the factory. Now, the British government didn't want their secret of industrialization to get leaked out to the rest of the world, but 2 brothers brought shops to Belgium, and they became the second nation to industrialize in 1807. Other countries in Europe followed, such as France and Prussia, and with the general trend of industrialization sweeping across the continent from west to east. Now, there was a couple of strong social oppositions to industrialization in the factories, and the Luddites to start in the rise of communism after Marx's manifesto was written, post-1847. The first opposition, the Luddites, were people that were opposed to industrialization, so they set about destroying factories in order to stop change. The second was the rise of communism after Marx published the Communist Manifesto. The reason was that the workers had been taken advantage of by factory owners. Long hours, risk of amputation or death by the machines, low wages, and other awful conditions contributed to the workers being, upset with conditions. I have a little skit about some of the really bad working conditions right now.
Boss, I lost my arm. My lungs.
Oh, what's happened to your lungs?
All the smoke, man. Oh, it hurts. I can't breathe half the time.
And how's that my concern?
I thought we have a family deal. Like, you're my boss. You're in charge of me. I'm like your son.
I'm your boss, not your dad. Okay, anything else wrong with you?
Can I please have a raise? I want to send my kids to school. They can't go to school right now because they need enough money. They need to work at the factory to get money to put food on the table.
And I'd be losing workers if I gave you a raise, wouldn't I? Why would I want to do that?
I thought you have a heart.
Oh, pish posh. Now go back out there and start working again before I send one of my supervisors around to rough you up for not meeting a quota, eh?
Goodbye, boss.
Goodbye.
So these bad working conditions are where communism come into play. It was something for the disgruntled workers to use in order for them to have an out for the conditions that they were facing. As a result of rising communism and socialism in the various industrialized countries, governments had to pass new laws that curbed the cruelty of the factory owners. In Britain, many laws were passed that limited the amount of time that women and children could work, and the Factory Acts of 1844, 1847, 1850, and 1856. The Mines Act, passed in 1842, was also made to combat children taking up dangerous jobs in mines. Additionally, the Act of 1850 established set working time for men so that activities can be planned around work, leading to recreational activities being planned around work times. Also, in Germany, Bismarck kind of created like the first sort of like social safety net for workers that were either injured on the job or couldn't work anymore. All right, back to recreational. So sport was becoming incredibly popular to play and watch, with the origins of some soccer clubs dating back to 1857, actually. I found that pretty interesting. And with that, I will conclude this episode. Hopefully this was informational and entertaining, and I hope to see you in the next one. Thank you for watching. Bye.